Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're going to get started on our new lecture series on observations. Now, observations are one of my favorite areas for research, and it's something that I have a lot of experience in. The funny thing about observations is they go by a lot of different names. You'll hear the phrase field research, field observations, unobtrusive observations, non-obtrusive observations, ethnography, and even simply people watching. These are all largely getting at the same idea that you're observing people as they live out their lives. The big difference is making sure that we put a line between simple observations, which is largely what we'll talk about today, and the idea of an ethnography. Now, I will talk about ethnography a few times because that's also one of my favorite areas for doing research, and it's also the source of a lot of my publications and books and so forth. But with ethnography, we're going into an in-depth 6-month plus period of time where we're writing other people's culture. Is literally graphos and ethnos means writing culture. So that's not really what you as an undergrad will be doing. Instead, what you could focus on at this point would be to do simple observations. In fact, you get a chance to think about that if you choose to do the observation assignment for your 2 of 4 assignments. We'll talk about that a little later. But remember, throughout this, as we think about the phrase observation, I'm thinking about the non-obtrusive observation where we aren't interacting with people, we're simply watching. Don't think that is the same thing as ethnography, which is much more in-depth. Again, we'll talk about those differences occasionally going forward, but I just want to take a moment and clear that up. Now, observations are really exciting because they offer some really cool strengths. And honestly, you'll note that there's a little bit of observations and interviews overlapping in terms of their strengths. Now, when Auguste Comte was building sociology as a field, he talked about his idea of positivism, which is studying our society through our senses. And wow, I mean, observation is a great example of that. I don't know that it was necessarily something that Comte was thinking of, but it sure fits the bill that we would watch our society, take notes, and try to understand what our actions mean. There's also a lot of interest too in observations because they give us really useful data about how we use spaces. Now, that may not have been something that you've been thinking about at all, but I want to think about applying this as a job skill. When you get out into the job market, observation experience is really great because you can observe people working in areas or how they interact with spaces, and that's data that can actually be helpful to your employer, whether that's doing observations on manufacturing floors, or even trying to understand how maybe people are following human resources policies. These are all things that you could observe in a business. So it gives you a really useful bit of information about that. Above and beyond that, observations are very personal. I can't really think, other than maybe really in-depth interviews, how we might get a more personal perspective on how people live out their lives. Because with the observation, you're seeing them as they live their lives and in the natural environment. Again, this isn't like a psychology thing where you're trying to recreate society in a lab. No, you're watching people as they live their lives and you're collecting data on that. Above and beyond that, observations are fun. If you like people watching, if you're one of those people who is quite content to sit at a restaurant and watch everyone else, you probably have a natural affinity for doing observations. That certainly was the description for me. I've always enjoyed watching other people live out their lives and just trying to understand why they do, guess what they might do. And it turned out that when it came time to actually do observations, and as a graduate student and as a professor, ethnographies, I just kind of feel like I had a natural flair for it. So if you like watching people, this observation approach is probably for you. The interviews maybe as well. There are some drawbacks, and there are serious drawbacks is the problem. As where with surveys and interviews, the drawbacks were largely the source of the issue with resources and time. With observations, you really have to have a narrow scope of things. There's no way that you can do observations and really get a large N, what we call a response rate. You also can't really get a large scope of ideas. You really have to hone in on one specific thing. Even for those of you who might choose the observation assignment, you'll note that we really have to hone in on what we're trying to watch. You're just not going to get a lot of cases because observations take a lot of time. They involve being in the field, taking notes, and observing what you see, and that's a very time-intensive thing. Likewise, too, if you're planning on doing something more in-depth like an ethnography, that's 6 months plus at minimum. You're just not going to be able to go into a community for a week or a day and really call it an ethnography. It's really probably going to be interviews mixed with non-obtrusive observations. By the way, that's what we call mixed methods, when you take two methods and you put them together, and that's perfectly okay, just for the record. With an ethnography, though, you're looking at something that's going to be 6 months to a year. And it can overlap again with interviews and other things like that, but they're just so much more involved. You're also going to see, too, that observations are a little tricky. With interviews, you have words that you're able to go through that coding process with. Now, with observations, we're similarly going to be coding them, but you are limited to the actions. You probably didn't get great quotes. You probably didn't get the words that people said with any real detail. And you're also limited to what you wrote down in your notebook, because there's always a chance you may not write down some key piece of information that might help to explain or explore your hypothesis. As such, observations are kind of troublesome. To add one more thing too, observations are something that are really hard to replicate. You can do the same observation of other people, but your chance to do an observation of the same person doing the same thing, it's probably almost nil unless it's like a job function or something that they do on a daily basis. So you really get limited there in terms of what you can do. That said, observations can be very valuable. Don't let these drawbacks be a problem. They really aren't. And at the undergraduate level, non-obtrusive, where you aren't bothering people, you're just watching them. Bothering is the wrong word. Talking to people or interacting with them. These non-obtrusive observations are actually very useful tools for starting to practice sociology, practice research methods, and learn about where you live and your community and so forth. So that's where we're going to stop for this lecture. Again, observation is something that's got a lot of strengths, but at the same time, it also has some drawbacks, and we'll keep these things in mind as we go forward. All right, if you have questions, you feel free to get in touch with me. You know where to find me. Otherwise, I'll see you in our next lecture. Take care.